This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. Communities across North Dakota can see big possibilities for education, infrastructure, conservation, and more. The state's oil and natural gas industry helps make them happen. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Well, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I've been gone for a while. I'm sure many of you who read my content online saw my article about fighting COVID. It was a harrowing experience, but we're not here to talk about that. I will say, if I sound a little funny as I'm doing the podcast, and maybe I don't, I don't know. I am still on oxygen, so if you hear me run out of steam as I'm asking a question that's probably way too long, that's why. My guest is Senator Kevin Cramer. Kevin, how you doing?
Well, I'm well, Rob, but I'm concerned for you. So I'm just so happy to be on and listening to you talk, and you sound fantastic. And here's the really good news with this podcast. If you start running out of breath talking, you know that when I start answering, you're going to have a long time to catch it again.
Well, that's the beautiful thing
I'm a senator, and I can filibuster.
Yeah, that's true. And the beautiful thing about the podcast as well is that we don't have a time limit. So other than your schedule. So there's a lot going on in the world right now. It's not a sad moment for American history. Mm-hmm. I think every reasonable person can agree to that. It's a terrible thing that happened at the Capitol. And of course it's in politics. So we go through this period where we need to assign blame. It's Antifa's fault. It's Trump's fault. It's everybody's fault. You've said some interesting things. I think in an MSNBC interview earlier this week, you said that the people at President Trump's rally held earlier in the morning of the riot, which by the way, that event was entirely peaceful. The things he said there, and some of the people on the stage said, were insightful. I think that was the word you used, as in inciting. And you've absolutely unequivocally condemned the rioters. But one thing you've said is that it's not Trump's fault. He doesn't have any blame in this at all. Is that accurate? That's how you feel?
Well, he doesn't have any blame. Here's why I say it's not his fault. It's the fault of every single person who violated the law. That's who is to blame. And one of the things that's so easy in this culture of ours today is to give blame to somebody for somebody else's actions, somebody else for somebody else's actions. And the reason I don't like to do that is because I don't like to take the person that committed the crime off the hook so easily. That's my point in that. There is no question that at that rally, starting with Rudy Giuliani, especially Rudy Giuliani probably, because he used the word combat. I oftentimes use the wrong word. And you might use it symbolically, or you might use it to make a point.
Sure, and Paul, we talk about we're fighting Democrats, Republicans, everybody does. I'm going to go and I'm going to fight for you in Washington, D.C. When Heidi Heitkamp said that, she didn't mean she was going to go to Washington and punch somebody in the nose. Right. She meant that she was going to fight legislatively to help people. I think we all understand that.
But I think in the context of a rally, the day that the votes are going to be counted by the Congress, saying we have to fight, or use combat, and then the President of the United States saying, let's march down to the Capitol, I'm going to go with you, which, of course, that's technically or literally not true either. You are setting people up. But I think the biggest part of inciting, Rob, in my view, if I might, I think it's making people believe something that's not true only makes them angrier that Congress, for example, can actually change the votes that a state cast for the president. That's not true. It's constitutionally not true. Or that we need to see what Mike Pence is going to do because he's got the power to flip the votes. He can reject the votes and send them back to the states. That is not true. It's not even a little bit true. There's not a single source that believes that's true. The people that were told that.
The one I saw circulating this morning held that because the vote to certify the Electoral College votes was delayed, that President Trump now has another 30 days to contest them or something like that, which is just a complete contrivance. Like, that's not true at all. But yet there's people out there who believe it. And the thing that really worried me, Kevin, is it wasn't just the people in Washington, D.C., because I wrote about this, extensively, and I think you know where I'm at. I'm done with President Trump. I understand why people supported him, and I support and maybe we should talk about this first. I believe we have to move on from President Trump. Not necessarily his ideas, because I think he has accurately identified some real trends in our country. I think he has identified accurately some real policy issues that Republicans need to not just be aware of, but act on. Trade policy, a lot of domestic policy, even a lot of foreign policy. I think he has been astute in assessing some of that. I also think that he is absolutely 1,000% the wrong leader to lead us on those things. And so I don't understand when you say that he has been, the best president of your lifetime. I don't understand that. I agree with you that he's identified the right issues. I'm looking for ways in which he has accomplished things on those issues, or has effectively led on those issues and created a movement that can lead, because I'm looking right now and the Republican Party and the conservative movement is in shambles. How does that make you a great president?
Well, because the ultimate job, and you can say the president has several responsibilities, he clearly does, but from a public policy standpoint, he has been the best one. He's cut taxes more than any other. He's cut regulations more than any other. These things are very significant to North Dakota and to our country. He's also, with regard to globalization and trade and whatnot, he's held China accountable in ways that other Republican presidents have actually facilitated. I mean, they've facilitated some of the problems we're dealing with in China today. He identified them, he took them on. So at the end of all of that, we are a better state because he's been the president of the United States. And some of the context of that probably are the times as well, because so many of the things he had to fight against had devolved to such a bad spot with regard to private property rights and energy development and the siting of infrastructure and all these things that his accomplishments are monumental. Now, the problem we deal with today, and I think this gets more to your specific question, is that all of that legacy is flushed down the toilet by what happened in the last couple of days. And I don't just mean the rioters. I mean his response to the rioters.
Well, I was going to say that was very disturbing to me. I read a report, and it was confirmed by Vice President Pence's office. And Pence, I think, is somebody both you and I have a lot of respect for. But more so given his conduct over the last few weeks, by the way, when he's been in a very uncomfortable position. I think he's led with dignity and grace. But Vice President Pence, he was the one who was at the top of the chain of command when they were deploying, unfortunately, because it was necessary, military assets, National Guard troops and whatnot, to back the rioters. The only reason for the vice president to be at the top of that command is because the president isn't doing anything, which to me is inexcusable. I don't know if that was something you caught, but I don't. Thank goodness Vice President Pence stepped in, but where was Trump?
So it's a great point, and I've pondered that. I haven't talked to anybody about it, Rob, so it's to be clear. One of the reasons that Vice President Pence may have been at the top of that chain might have been because he was actually in the United States Capitol. In other words, he was in the very building that was under siege. And by the way, he never left it, from my understanding. And so he was, in many respects, the commander on site. And so probably whether it was yielded to him or it just sort of naturally went his direction when they were looking for direction on what they ought to be doing with the National Guard, he was the person at the highest levels with the best information at his fingertips. But I'm only speculating about that, Rob. I don't know that the commander-in-chief, wasn't doing anything, so therefore Mike Pence was, or whether the commander-in-chief, just sort of acquiesced to him. But you're right. It was a peculiar report of the vice president being the person commanding the National Guard.
What did you see in President Trump's response to the rally that bothered you? You went into that, and then I interjected my own point of view.
Sure, no. But because you were agreeing, the first thing I saw was he didn't get to the point very quickly. In other words, he should have been out front much faster condemning those actions, much faster. He eventually came out after President-elect Joe Biden made what I thought was a fantastic statement. Gracious, graceful, affirming, as well as condemning where condemnation was appropriate, and he did it just in a very skilled manner. Then the president came out, but again, the president used his moment, his first words to condemn the rioters. First, he empathized with them, and if you can't tell, and some of my even most conservative talk radio host friends know, I'm in a no, yeah, but mood. I don't care what Democrats have done for 4 years. It's not that I don't care, but in this context, how unjust they may have been. I don't care how unjust the New York Times, Washington Post, mainstream media has been. All of those other things, true as they may be, are irrelevant to the moment. I'm not going to set aside my moral compass because they don't have one, or because mine isn't theirs, or any of that. I'm in a no, yeah, but mood. There's only one thing to say about the riots. They were unjust. They were riots. They were thugs. They're awful. There's no excuse for them whatsoever. They're criminals, 100% criminals. And they were attacking democracy. That's what they were doing, the very democracy they pretend that they were upholding. Whatever their motivation, whatever their passions, none of it's an excuse for criminal activity. And so, I'm a little bit frustrated, as you can tell, by some people who want to sort of rationalize it. Just as I was frustrated with people who want to rationalize an extra constitutional duty by objecting to single slates of electors certified by a state, as though somehow the Congress of the United States could justify doing that.
It's remarkable how many things the right has done in the past few weeks that are basically things that we complained about Democrats doing. Where, right. A National Review made the point that we're making the same sort of objection to election results that Republicans reviled when it was Senator Barbara Boxer doing it in 2004. We're hatching conspiracy theories about election fraud. And I say that fully acknowledging that there have been some problems in some states. I don't think they rise to the level of having cost President Trump the election. I don't see any evidence of that. Mm-hmm. But clearly there are states that need to address some problems. But some people have conspiracy. I mean, you look at some of the things Sidney Powell is saying that are just completely bogus. And I think back to things Democrats said about George W. Bush and his victories in 2000 and 2004, where there were conspiracy theories about Diebold voting machines, and Diebold executives had made donations to Republican candidates and all these things. I think about what we said about left-wing protests, how they were violent and they were destroying property and they were hurting people and they were hurting police officers. And then I had to watch a bunch of Trump supporters storm the Capitol, and I saw video of a guy beating a cop with one of the Thin Blue Line flags. Yeah. I mean, it's just astounding. I'm struggling to understand how it even happens. But what can Republican leaders do to combat that? Because I'll tell you right now, obviously I've had some strong things to say about President Trump, but what I'm running into is if you criticize President Trump, there is a large faction, even here in North Dakota, who will just excommunicate you. You're a rhino. You're not a conservative. I've been called a communist. I'm now a communist, apparently, because I'm a Trump critic. That's where a lot of Trump supporters are. How do we break that?
Well, that's a great question, and I think here's an opportunity for a role for Donald Trump himself if he's willing to play it, and that is he's the person that can help with that moving forward. I'm not overly hopeful, Rob, but he does have that opportunity. Beyond that, what do we do? We have to continue to move forward, but one of the things Republican politicians and leaders should not do is go back to being the party we were before Donald Trump. To your point about particularly the international issues, the global trade issues, and recognizing some of these things, because that's the old Republican Party that ignored those things and didn't pay attention to the blue collar workforce, the forgotten man and woman, if you will, that were being hurt by trade policies, and we have to recognize that. The interesting thing, and I like to use the Georgia elections as an example of this, and this is just my theory, but people will have all kinds of reasons why different things happen in Georgia. But but during the general election, when Donald Trump was on the ballot in Georgia, David Perdue won. In the special election or the runoff election, when Donald Trump was not on the ticket, David Perdue lost.
Yeah.
Now, what do you draw from that? What I draw from that is you can't have a successful Republican Party without Donald Trump, without the Donald Trump, recognizing Donald Trump's policies and philosophies that are a little different than the traditional Republicans, particularly as it relates to, as you and I have talked about many times, in some depth, in fact, populism and what does populism mean. And so I think we can't be successful without that, without recognizing that, and Donald Trump can't be successful without mainstream Republicans. And so we have to take those policies and ideas, and that doesn't mean we have to adopt everything 100%, but we can't just simply ignore it and say, okay, let's go back to being the globalist.
Yeah.
I
don't want to go backwards. I mean, clearly, because in any political era, you have to evolve because the problems that face America evolve, our populations evolve, our economies evolve. You can't just stake out one set of policy issues and then ride that horse indefinitely. You have to evolve. And President Trump clearly identified ways in which the Republican Party needed to evolve. But do you think after everything that happened at the Capitol, is President Trump an effective messenger for those policies now?
I doubt that he is, quite honestly. I've had many people that are strong supporters of his call me and thank me for, first of all, for my position regarding the Electoral College. And then, of course, for things I've said since then. But I've had many, many more who, to your point, say I'm a rhino and I should have my head lopped off because I don't support Trump enough. And yet Axios lists me as the top senator in terms of loyalty to Donald Trump. And
I don't know if you've read it. My employer forum, the forum, just published an editorial. You're a Trump. I forget. I think crony or lapdog or something like that. But I don't know that it's funny to watch that perception where suddenly after all this time you've certainly been outspoken in your support for President Trump, which is not a position you've taken that I am particularly in agreement with, but it's a true thing. And yet one criticism of Trump earns you revulsion. It's a remarkable development.
Excommunication.
Yeah,
it is a remarkable development. But the thing that the Fargo Forum has never been able to quite accept probably is that Donald Trump's policies really have been great for North Dakota. And he paid a lot of attention to North Dakota. And his cabinet paid a lot of personal attention, not just to our state, but specific counties, to specific people. This is a remarkably accessible administration, the likes of which we've not seen since Abraham Lincoln. And regardless of whether you like his behavior or not, he's been really good for us. And so...
unfortunately, his behavior, like you said, overshadowed a lot of real policies. And I worry now... ask you, how lasting are a lot of his policies going to be? And understanding politics is transitory. No Congress, no president can make law, except for President Obama, apparently, with the Dreamers. I guess he can make law that nobody's allowed to issue an executive order that nobody's allowed to overturn, according to the courts. But President Trump, it seems like a lot of his accomplishments were accomplished through executive order. And that we're going to see President Biden undo a lot of them. And because President Trump couldn't get elected. So, how much of President Trump's legacy in terms of policy that he enacted during his term is going to stand the test of time?
Well, one of his most important legacies, probably his most important legacy that can't be undone, are the lifetime appointments of 54 appellate judges, 3 Supreme Court justices, and about 175 district federal court judges. Because those are, like I said, lifetime appointments, and federalism was, the most important thing he did in a sort of an umbrella sense. So a lot of his other regulations, rules, even guidance, agency by agency, provide more power back to states. And having that backstop of the courts, and I know you hate the notion of litigating everything, I do too, but there's a reason we have courts, and they'll be able to arbitrate, hopefully, and litigate in a more conservative manner, given that Donald Trump was president for 4 years, that he used the the Federalist Society as sort of a filter for a lot of his judges and justices.
I think that's true.
We have a better, that's his, in my mind, that's his greatest legacy.
I think that's true. A lot of talk now of removing President Trump from office, and there's essentially, I guess, three ways that could happen. He could resign, which some Republicans have called on him to do. He could be removed by his cabinet by way of the 25th Amendment, which seems unlikely to me because the members of his cabinet that are most likely to lead that charge are leaving. Or he could be impeached and convicted, which is really the only part of that process, any of those processes that you could be involved with directly. If the House votes to impeach, which seems likely because they just need a simple majority vote, and Democrats are certainly talking about that. I think even Speaker Pelosi is talking about it, despite her reticence during the previous, at least during the beginning of the previous impeachment process. It seems very likely that the House is going to impeach. If it gets to the Senate, would you vote to convict at this point? I mean, obviously, we don't know what the impeachment articles would be, but I mean, what do you think of those efforts, I guess, is maybe a more accurate question.
Well, I think you shouldn't be, on the one hand, talking about moving forward and then at the same time talking about impeaching a president who's got 12 days left in office. I think this is exactly the kind of activity that is not conducive to healing a nation. And I would hope that smarter people than Nancy Pelosi, like maybe Joe Biden, would have enough influence and common sense to walk her off that cliff. But you can always rely on Nancy Pelosi to go too far. I mean, she's like Hillary Clinton. You can count on them every time they think they have moral high ground to flush it down.
But it's not just. I mean, it's not just Nancy Pelosi. I mean, some of your Republican colleagues are talking this way in both the House and the Senate. Granted, there's not a lot of them, but certainly Mitt Romney, Senator Sass from Nebraska. There's a Republican congressman from Illinois whose name is now escaping me. I always have problems with House members because there's 435 of them, so I can't remember them all.
Adam Kinzinger.
That's right. That's right. So I mean, it's not just Nancy Pelosi. I mean, there are Republicans who think I think he should be removed from office, and I understand the point you just made about we need to heal the nation and we need to move forward. It seems to me that a bipartisan rebuke of President Trump, and specifically his behavior at the end of his term, is needed. As a practical matter, you're right. He's got just days left. His cabinet's leaving him. I don't know what else he could do at this point. But symbolically, I think it would be powerful, a cleansing, that we need to move into a new era with a president that neither you or I like all that much, but understanding that this sort of behavior from a president is not going to be tolerated. Our expectation as a nation are peaceful transitions of power, not what President Trump has presided over. Do you I mean, does that perspective resonate with you at all?
I don't think that I'd give the weight to it that you would, given that we have domestic issues that would only be worsened by that kind of activity. I mean, we have 12 days. And so you asked, if I'd vote for conviction. We haven't, like you said, we haven't seen articles of impeachment yet. We'd have to have a trial. You'd have to have evidence presented, and he has a right in that trial to be defended. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that you whip up in a 48-hour period. It really isn't. And if you did, I don't think that would be viewed effectively enough. Frankly, even with regards to the election outcome, it doesn't matter why people are suspicious of it or have doubts about it. The problem is that too many of them do to ignore it. I just don't see that happening or helping. With regard to the 25th Amendment, this isn't even a 25th Amendment issue. I've been reading the 25th Amendment today. I've been reading a lot of amendments in the last, as you know, week or so of our Constitution, and this just doesn't even seem like a 25th Amendment issue, much less the practical matter of implementing it. I just think we have to land this plane over the course of the next 12 days. I say we, all of us collectively, and especially his administration. I think his administration is best served by Mike Pence maybe taking more of a leadership role, people like Mark Meadows and others who might be tempted to abandon ship. This is when they really just have to stay in place and help facilitate this peaceful transition, which the president has now, as you know, that the president has now committed to out loud, and in what I thought was a pretty good statement. It wasn't great. It would have been a better statement a couple of days ago, but he's committed to that, and I think we have to take him at his word, because I frankly think there's still an opportunity to rehabilitate some of this without his removal, but maybe even better while he's still in place.
He also announced that he's not going to attend President-elect Biden's inauguration, which I don't think is very helpful. Frankly, I appreciate the leadership of former President George W. Bush, who said he would. Mm-hmm. I'm certain not because President Bush is all that happy that Joe Biden won the election. I don't think Joe Biden is a president that he necessarily wants in office, but because he respects the process. I think that sort of leadership is what we've needed from President Trump and, frankly, many other Republicans.
Well, one of the things I was recalling the inauguration 4 years ago. Remember, a number of Democrat members of Congress boycotted
that's true.
Donald Trump's inauguration, and I just thought that was just an awful message to send. And then they started their impeachment process, the next day, and that has contributed to this. There's no question about that. Has contributed to this, to the situation we're in today. All of that's unexcusable, as is the president's recent behavior is unexcusable. But one image that I'll never forget, that was vivid, and I locked it in because of how vivid it was to see both President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, President Trump's opponent, on the rostrum at his inauguration. As difficult as that had to have been for them, and I mean painfully difficult, they were there. Now, I do think the circumstances in this situation are such that, I'm not even sure I know what would have been better, whether Donald Trump's there or not there, but I'm not shocked that he's not going to be there.
One thing, and you alluded to this earlier, and I think you made the absolutely 100% right point, that nothing the left has done justified the riot at the Capitol. And there's a danger, and I think a lot of people have fallen into this trap of trying to change the subject at the very least, or frankly even excuse it by saying, well, look at the other protests. I do think, though, that there is an important point to be made about the ongoing trend of political escalation in the United States of America, and I think it's got a long timeline, and on so many fronts, where that's what's happened to the filibuster, where Democrats eroded it, then Republicans eroded it further. I have a feeling that we may not have a filibuster in this term of. I have a feeling the filibuster may go the way of the dodo in this term of Congress. I guess we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. We have seen violent protests, and I remember this summer. I mean, there were commentators right here in North Dakota. As we were watching, certainly we saw violence in downtown Fargo. We certainly saw violence in Minneapolis. And we had commentators here in North Dakota. I'm still remembering that Lloyd Omdahl column headline where I think it was "Only riots and burning spur action" or something like that. They justified the violence. And I was warning at the time, this is escalation. If you guys justify it and say, okay, this is the new norm, where if you're ticked off about something, you can go to some cities downtown and start, busting out window shops and stuff, or people have nothing to do with the policy issue that you're protesting. That's going to become a norm. And again, that excuses nothing that happened at the Capitol. But I look at both sides, and it's like they're escalating. Like, they do this, well, we do it, but worse, and then they do it worse. And at what point is it the responsibility of leaders within the party to talk not to the other side, but their own side, and say some version of knock it off? Because this is overshadowing anything we could hope to accomplish. I look at the Black Lives Matter movement. I think they had a just cause. I may disagree with them in some of the particulars and some of what they would like to do about it, but the cause against police violence is a just one. I think it's a problem in the United States, and there's things that we need to do to fix it. And that got completely overshadowed when we watched Portland burn, right? When we watched Chicago burn, we watched Minneapolis burn. And I think the right's done that to themselves, and it's not productive. It's not getting anything done. And even worse, it's hurting people. People are dying. 4 people, 5 now? died because of the Capitol riot? I mean, it's terrible. So what role do leaders in the Republican and Democratic Party and political leaders and frankly even pundits like myself, what role do we have in trying to cool things down? How can we do that?
Yeah, it's a great point because I think pundits like yourself probably play as big a role as anybody, and the fact that there's now only left media and right media is a really big problem. The fact that the New York Times and the Washington Post use unnamed sources all the time to justify whatever editorial position they want to take. There's just such a lack of trust in our media, so that's a big part of it, and I think we do have to have that discussion, and we have to talk about the role of big tech and censorship and all of those things, but none of them are easy. None of them are easy, but that's a big part of it. To your point about what do leaders do, one of the things that I really want to point people to is if you didn't watch the Congress of the United States coming back together the other night, on Wednesday night, I'd really encourage people to watch the United States Senate as we came back from being in hiding for 6 hours or however long it was. It seemed like a lifetime on one hand. On the other hand, it seemed like minutes. But when we went back to the chambers after they had been inhabited by these rioters and thugs, after our stuff had been ransacked, but now put all back together by employees, we went back into that same chamber. The Vice President of the United States of America, Donald Trump's Vice President, took the chair and gave a speech. And following his speech was Mitch McConnell's speech, and then Chuck Schumer's speech. I think people should watch those three speeches and let you draw the conclusions you want to draw. I would also turn, though, even earlier in that evening, look at the opening speech of the opening of the discussion and debate on the Arizona objection. The opening speech was by Mitch McConnell, who gave in my view, a soaring message that lifted everybody up. Attempted to unify, focus back on the Constitution and our sacred responsibilities. And then Chuck Schumer's speech after that, where Chuck Schumer looked a lot more like a New York City, brawler than a leader. And look at those two and compare those two speeches, remembering that that Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell were on the same side on the issue of the Senate's role in objecting to the ballots in Arizona. And yet he couldn't accept the victory. He instead had to instill this smackdown, this punch down. So we do have roles to play. But the good news was, and I want to get back more to that, I think that some of that already began, and it began that night when remember this now, there were 12 senators that were objectors, but the objection only got 6 votes. And that change of mind, that being influenced perhaps somewhat by the events of the night, for sure, the rioting and stuff, and the consequence of what I believe is a lie that we could even have anything to say about this as a Congress, but also the recognition of speeches from people that really do know the Constitution and uphold it, even as well as anybody. People like Mike Lee and Rand Paul and Tom Cotton. I mean, you want to hear 2 great speeches? Go and listen to Mike Lee's speech and Rand Paul's speech on in response to those objections. Just phenomenal stuff. So I think some of it's already happening. We fulfilled our duty that night, even after the riots.
I hope so. I think it needs to be bigger than that. It's almost got to be a cultural shift. I mean, the big thing is we need to stop. And I was having before I went to bed last night, I was having a Facebook discussion with a liberal friend from Fargo who was checking in on me on the COVID stuff, and we were talking a little bit about nationally and just how do we move past this thing where we feel like we can't just agree with each other, but the other side has to be mendacious or evil or what have you, or liars, even when they're not necessarily lying, they're just making a different argument than you are. I don't know how we move past that as a society, and I guess part of me even wonders if the solution can come from the top down. I think Americans themselves, sometimes we make this mistake that a celebrity can go out and say a thing, and then we're all just automatic, and we're just so and so said this, so now I'm going to do it. Sometimes Americans just have to decide to be better. And I think Americans across the country need to decide to be better.
So I love this talk. So thanks for raising it, because I think you're right. Oftentimes, as you know, you've heard me say this. Oftentimes people think that that the Trump movement are people responding to Donald Trump. I'm not so sure that the Trump movement isn't Donald Trump responding to people. And a lot of times, we are the reflection. That is the whole point of self-governance. We as leaders are the reflection. Now, what I've tried to do in my leadership, and it's why I do this podcast, it's why I do a lot of talk radio, and it's why I never walk by the sticks at the Capitol, without talking to the media. But it's because you have to have the conversation, you have to open your mouth and talk. And just the other day, I was doing Fox Business, the Mornings with Maria show, and Nancy Cortez, who's a journalist for CBS TV, and I know Nancy, I don't know her well, but she's one of the people who's often at the sticks, and she saw me, she asked me to come over and do a long interview. She didn't ask me to do a long interview, it turned into a long interview on camera for CBS with her. And one of the things we talked about was, what is the media's role? I said, Nancy, I want to share with you something. I said, we on the Environment and Public Works Committee, I chair the Water Subcommittee. We passed unanimously a Water Resource Development Act. It's a water infrastructure authorization, unanimously, and now it's the law of the land. But nobody's ever written about it. No one's ever broadcast about it. Nobody's interested in the things that we do. I said, do you know how rare a 50-50 vote is in the United States Senate? And that was the point of her discussion. She wanted to talk about the Senate going forward. It's a 50-50 split. I said, it almost never happens. We passed the largest highway bill in history unanimously in the Environment and Public Works Committee. We passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and then the only real news was that we overrode the president's veto. But my point being that we do a lot of things well together. It's just that it's not very interesting to people, because it's not very interesting to the people who report the things that Congress does that are, if not unanimous, they're oftentimes obviously negotiated outcomes, but they're pretty cool. It's the way I think the founders designed it to be.
It's interesting because I think what you're talking about, I don't think that we could forget. And the media, I mean, there's sort of this symbiotic relationship between sort of staged combat between elected political figures, right, who go on cable news, they say horrible, nasty things about each other, and then they go out and have lunch together. Right.
Right.
And it even happens in the news, like where it's like you have two talking heads on cable news and they're screaming at each other and they hate each other. And then the camera turns off and they like high five and like, all right, well, it's, everything's fine. It's kabuki theater. Like it's fake. Yeah. And gosh, I don't particularly enjoy writing about and talking about the soap opera of politics. Right. I mean, the problem is so much of it does really impact policy. I mean, you can't ignore this stuff when you get to a point where people are burning things down in the streets. I mean, that might be a time where like, hey, maybe we need to knock this off because this isn't just infotainment anymore. This is having a real reckoning with the American public. So that does frustrate me. Since we brought up policy, let's talk about policy. What does the policy agenda look like specifically from a North Dakota perspective in this new Congress that's emerging?
Well, this is why the loss of the Senate, Republicans losing the Senate or getting a 50-50 split, is a little more consequential than a single Senate seat or a couple of single Senate seats or even just a majority, because the Senate, as you know, has this advise and consent role. That is to say, we confirm something like 1,200 positions that are appointed by the President of the United States. And when you lose leverage as the minority party in that process. And when there's a divided government, a divided Senate and executive especially, that checks and balance is pretty important, and we've sort of lost that now. And so that makes it a little more difficult for us to keep the Biden administration, should they go down the path of a more progressive agenda, particularly as it relates to private property rights, infrastructure development, and siting, and environmental rules and regulations. I don't get to threaten a hold on the EPA administrator, for example, or the Secretary of Defense, for example.
Do you think the Senate? I mean, you said 1,200. Do you think that's too many? I mean, does the Senate really need to confirm that many people?
No, I don't think that it does. But I say that, but on the one hand, on the other hand, the biggest problem in Washington D.C. is the bureaucracy, how
True.
deep it goes. This issue of the deep state, while it sounds sort of wild and conspiratory, it's also very real. Whether it's an intentional political movement, that is one thing.
I think that's something where they've taken a real problem, which I think is entrenched, which I don't think is as sinister as some of the conspiracy theories make it out to be, but it is real. Where you just get people who have been in office, and frankly, they complain about it in Bismarck too, right? I mean, what's the complaint? The refrain among North Dakota lawmakers is that the executive branch has 2 years to prepare to fool them for 80 days, right? Because that's all the time that they're in session. I mean, that's their complaint, which is maybe has a grain of truth in it, but. I mean, I think there is a problem where you have somebody who's been in an office for 30 years. I know all about this. You're a freshman congressman, or you've only been here for 8 years or something. Get out of my face. I'm going to do things the way, or we're going to be underhanded and we're going to, try to just keep things the way we want them, even as you're trying to reform things. That's a real fight. And it's not particularly unique to the federal government or the United States even, but it's a real thing. But yet again, we've taken this conspiracy theory where now it's like, well, but these people are also in pedophile rings, or they're doing this or that. And I mean, it sounds outlandish, but then thousands and thousands of people retweet them and believe them and everything. And it's like you are hurting our ability to solve this problem by doing this stuff.
Right. And that's why I get back to the judiciary as the Trump legacy that provides a little better backstop. Remember, I've only had the opportunity to sit through and then vote on one Supreme Court nomination. That of course, was Amy Coney Barrett. My whole discussion with her was about the issue of federalism and the role of states. And unfortunately, the courts have become the only backstop. And people might even forget this, but remember things like the Clean Air Act, which was horrible, or the Clean Water Act, the Waters of the U.S. rule that the Democrats put forward were horrible. The courts did reject those and did send them back to the states. The Clean Air Act went too far in its jurisdiction, in taking jurisdiction away from states, and same with the Waters of the U.S. rule. So the courts do have a role to play, and they do work. And now we're even better armed with more conservative constitutionalists on all of our courts, and that should be helpful. But to your point about the bureaucracy being locked down. The reason it's worse at the federal level is because of this lack of federalism. The reason that it's worse at the federal level is because on top of having a lot of people with a lot to say about really important things, these are people who, in most cases nowadays, come from someplace other than the places that are most affected by their decisions. They're also largely liberal. And this gets to a much larger issue, and that even has to do with the staffers that work for the committees that work for members of Congress, including Republicans, because these staffers are young people who came up through the education system in a much different time than I did and than you did, and in a progressive university and college system. And so even if their leanings are right, they tend to be, indoctrinated with a lot of very left-leaning stuff. And so we have a really big problem in our institutions, and we're not going to address it with a single election, but we have to at least be honest about it and have the discussion about it. And my hope, and the consequences, by the way, of these federal bureaucrats are so great to places like North Dakota, any place out west, frankly. And so we have to, again, the courts right now are about our only backstop, but we have to continue to fight the fight and have the discussions and have the debates and have the hearings and reveal things, because there still is, there's still people who pay attention. But that's not to say it's easy.
So in terms of, obviously, one of the things that we struggled with during, talking about the deep state and the bureaucracy, one thing that we struggled with the Trump presidency was getting members of his administration confirmed. In fact, I think even as he's leaving office, did he fill every appointment that he was supposed to? I'm pretty sure he didn't. Or did every position get? But that has become a trend where one side objects to the other. And I know you and I have talked about this. I mean, at some point, Joe Biden won the election. He gets to govern, right? So unless he appoints somebody who's just outrageously unqualified, you got to let him appoint it. And like, ideological differences are not a disqualification. We have an ideological disqualification. I mean, anybody that Joe Biden appoints is probably going to have ideological differences with you and I, but he gets to appoint them, and that's not disqualifying. Is there going to be an effort? I think Republicans ought to lead an effort to not do what Democrats did to Trump and not give Joe Biden's appointees a hard time unless it's warranted.
Well, it's a really now you're making a very important point. It's a very high calling, and it's going to be difficult because there are a lot of long memories. The reality, though, is that since we don't have a majority in the Senate, at least for the first two years, we can't, sort of unilaterally stop nominations from going forward because even if we had the majority by one vote, there's still plenty of Republicans who might, for one reason or another, want to support a nominee from Biden. We just lose our leverage and be able to even hold it up. Will we be able to lead that effort? I don't know. If we do lead that effort, will we be rewarded for it? I don't know. And other than with perhaps a better government. But I think it's really important to note that 6 people who served on the cabinet of Donald Trump got no Democratic votes. Supreme Court justice got no Democratic votes. It's going to take a little bit to get over that. With regard to several of the other lower level ones, remember that the reason we couldn't get a lot of them confirmed was because Chuck Schumer insisted on using the filibuster. Think of this. Clarence Thomas, when he was nominated to the United States Supreme Court, and we all, if either we remember or we've read the history about it, I unfortunately remember it, and went through this brutal claim of sexual harassment and all that stuff. And when it was all said and done, even his vote wasn't filibustered. He wasn't confirmed with the 60 votes, but they didn't filibuster the vote. So we just live in a very different time, and maybe this is the time when with a 50-50 split, the challenge on the United States Senate is to find a way to be more cordial and more accommodating to the president's nominees than Democrats were to Donald Trump.
With the understanding that it's going to be reciprocated when one of ours is in charge. I mean, yeah. I think that's, but that's because it's an arms race right now. It really is, and nobody wants to unilaterally disarm, and it's difficult. Last question for you, because we're bumping up against the time that you've generously made available to me. One thing that you said to me years ago that I've always really taken to heart is that political movements win through addition and not subtraction. It seems like the Trump movement, and like it or not, I mean, President Trump's approval numbers among Republicans have all, maybe that's changed with the events of just recently, but historically, throughout his time in office, have been through the roof, right? Republicans like President Trump. So the Republican Party is in a lot of ways the Trump movement. How do Republicans win through addition going forward? Because we just came through a dark moment. I mean, it's whatever the Democrats did over the summer, doing that at the United States Capitol is worse. It just is. And doing it
it's also more recent.
More recent, and also doing it to disrupt a vote in Congress is worse. And granted, I understand that's happened at like state legislatures and stuff, and that's awful too. But this was right in people's face. How does the Republican Party become a party that wins through addition again, and a party, frankly, where our Republican presidents can win the national popular vote instead of leaning on the Electoral College?
Yeah, that last part, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if that's even possible. You got to hope and believe that it is, but it's also why we have to hang on to the Electoral College forever.
Well, absolutely.
Our founders knew that.
I'm not a proponent of the national popular vote picking the president, just to be clear.
But you're right. It is awfully nice for a president to have both. There's no question about it. But your question is, how do we maintain a majority status or get a majority status? And I think it's, as I said earlier, it's two things. One, while we distance ourselves, if you will, and I think that's what you're saying. I shouldn't speak for you. You're more incapable of doing that. But as Republicans may distance themselves from the person of Donald Trump, we have to somehow hang on to the movement that he's created. And that is the populist movement that recognizes that not all things global are noble, that an America First agenda is not in and of itself a bad thing. That in fact it's got a lot of merit, and that's how he brought the working American back to the Republican Party where they once were, and and then we lost them. Realizing that there's going to be none of this happens in a vacuum. It's not like it's just us, making these decisions. Democrats are going to be making their decisions as well. One of the things that you'll see will always happen, and it's already beginning, as I mentioned earlier. Democrats will overplay their hand. That's why there are cycles. That's why people elect Republicans for a while, and then they elect Democrats for a while, then they elect Republicans for a while, because we remind the people what was about us that they didn't like, before.
Yeah.
And it might be a weaker national defense, or it might be whatever. So I really don't have the pessimism that other people have, neither about our party nor about our republic. The foundation is really, really strong. And I think that foundation has demonstrated its strength, just in the last several days. And while it may seem more and more fragile all the time. But the other thing I might say, Rob, is, and I intend to have a conversation with my pastor about this. The faith community has to get out of politics. And that means liberals, and that means conservatives. That means, evangelicals, and that means mainstream. I'm talking about Christianity now, of course, but they've got to get out of the role of politics. They certainly need to take stands for justice and moral standards and traditional values and those kinds of things that whatever their denomination leans toward. They need to do that, but they need to do that in the context of the gospel. They need to do that in the context of a sovereign God. They need to do that within the context of their doctrine and theology, not in the context of politics. And I think that could go a long ways in changing that culture, as you talked about. I mean, I've often, you maybe don't remember this, you're too young probably, but, when I was a young state party chairman and Democrats had the governorship for 28 out of the previous 32 years, I had the gall, if you can imagine, I was 30 years old, to appoint a pro-life and pro-choice co-chairs of our resolutions committee at our state convention. The pro-life people wanted to take my head off, and dang near did. But I said, if we don't have the discussion, we're going to lose people. We need to add people to our ranks, not lose them, because we've been losing elections for so long at that point. I thought it was, as I look back on it, I think it was pretty darn. It was gutsier than I thought it was at the time, but I think it was pretty helpful too that we were adding people. We're still listening to them. We're still the pro-life party. I wasn't advocating that we weren't be, but I was advocating that pro-life, pro-choice people needed to feel like they had a place in our party.
That one issue wouldn't necessarily be the defining for everybody. I mean, I know
right.
for pro,
right.
it is for some, but not for everybody. I mean, other peoples might say, well, I disagree with the Republicans' position on abortion, but I really like where they're at on regulation or taxation or spending or any of these other panoply of issues that lays before us. I mean, why people vote the way they do is complicated, which, by the way, is something we learned from the Trump era. I mean, you roll back the clock, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and everybody was talking about how the Republican Party was going to be demographically was going to be driven the way of the Whigs, and it wasn't, because what we're learning is just because you're a certain race or a certain gender or even a certain sexual orientation, that doesn't necessarily dictate your vote. I mean, there are gay Republicans who are not comfortable with the traditional Republican point of view on things like gay marriage, but they're also business owners, and they would like to see government kept small and government kept within its box, and so they're Republicans. I mean, these are calculations that people make. Hispanic people who maybe aren't comfortable with the way President Trump is talking about the border wall or something, or some of the things he said about the people of their race, but yet they want to build pipelines, for instance. Like me, this guy, he's a pipeliner and he wants to build pipelines. And gosh, who are you going to vote for if you want to build pipelines in America right now? Well, you're going to vote for Republicans. So, I mean, that is a big problem with journalism, is we like to shrink things down into simplistic narratives that can be repeated over and over again. And frankly, the politicians love it too, because it's good for them. It's as much as everybody complains about the news media, and there's plenty to complain about, sure, there's no denying the symbiotic relationship between the news media and the political demagogues, and it's a feedback loop that isn't doing anybody any good.
Well, dog whistles have served politicians very well in many circumstances and situations. I would point, though, to again, that's the recent events. We have good conservative, lawyerly Republicans who rationalized voting to object to another state's electors.
Ted Cruz
And
among them.
Ted
who
Cruz,
I
Josh
was,
Hawley.
Yeah.
Right.
Ted Cruz is
Yeah,
not
these
a
are
stupid.
really highly respected people.
He's a
dumb
Harvard
guys, no.
educated lawyer, and
Yep.
and
Yep.
came to that conclusion. And I mean, listen, I get it. I think sometimes you desire a political outcome so thoroughly that you just start rationalizing your way to it. I'm a fat guy, so sometimes for me it's like do I need another cookie? Right? And I rationalize myself. Well, I did go up that extra flight of stairs today, so I could probably reward myself, and then I continue to be fat. So that's what that gets you, if that analogy works at all, which it probably doesn't.
I'm sitting here smiling. No, it is. It's actually a very good one. I'm just thinking of all the times I've been guilty of what you're talking about. But anyway,
yeah, but you're a hell of a lot skinnier than I am. So good for you for whatever you're doing. Kevin, I've used up all of our time and then some, so I'll let you go. Thank you so much for coming on, and good luck.
Always my pleasure, and good luck to you as well. Thanks, Rob.